Now, at this time, I'd like to introduce Cheryl Norton with Kentucky American Water, our presenting sponsor for today, and she has a few remarks for us. Cheryl.
Well, thanks to all of you guys for coming out on such a beautiful day. Isn't it wonderful outside? Boy, I tell you. You know, I've been here for about 3 years now, and when I come to work on a day like this, my heart goes out to my employees who are outside working in this rain, to our mailmen and all the other utility people who are out there working no matter what the weather is. In fact, for the water utility, and I know the electric utility is probably preparing frantically in case we do get the kind of ice storm that they're talking about, the cold weather can be very problematic for us. A change in the temperature causes main breaks and just causes a lot of problems throughout the business. So just keep all of those employees in mind as you go to your warm office or get in your warm car and go to do different things, because we've got people out there working in the elements all the time, and they're out there whether they want to be or not. They're out there doing a great job for us, so we really do appreciate that. And I want to thank Bob and his team, Katie and everybody, for putting on this program. I think they've just done a fantastic job of getting some really very high quality speakers this year and all the previous years that I've been here as well. I've enjoyed so much being a part of this. So thanks to Bob and Katie, we really appreciate that. So, you know, they asked me if I would be interested in introducing Andy, and I said, yeah, sure, that would be just fantastic. I had been here not all that long, and I got a call from Andy and went and had coffee with him. And at that point, he was getting ready to run for office. And, you know, we had a great conversation, and part of the thing that I took away from that first conversation with Andy was that he really was truly a family man, and he cared about the impact of what was going on in the world on our families. And I think that's so important as we look at Washington and what's going on there. We've always got to keep in mind the people that are back here in Kentucky. And so for those of you who don't know Andy, probably most of you do, he graduated from the University of Virginia with a government and philosophy degree. Cool, huh? So government, philosophy, is that all the same? I don't know. So anyway, Andy didn't see the light and come back to Kentucky right away. He stayed out there and did some great work for Jim Talent, who became senator out there in Washington, D.C. area. But eventually he saw the light and he came back to Kentucky. Like I said, I've been here about 3 years. I've fallen in love with the area. It's beautiful here. And I know that Andy wanted to come back and come home. And so he came back and went to UK to law school and just really feels passionate about doing what's right for the community and for the state. And you can look at Andy's, the bills that he sponsored and think about the things that he's really been focused on. And he's bringing it back home. He's looking out for the horse industry. He's looking out for the bourbon industry, the distilleries, and trying to hold government accountable. And we may not always agree with every decision that's made in Washington, D.C., but I have to say about Andy, if I didn't agree with what Andy said, he's always accessible. Andy's somebody that is always around. He's probably spoken at more of these public policy luncheons than just about anybody, and I've seen him at numerous other events. So if you have a question for Andy, he's always there for you to talk to and ask him and kind of give him your feedback. So with that, I want to say, Andy, we're so thrilled to have you here today, and on behalf of Kentucky American and Lexington, welcome.
Thank you, Cheryl, for those very, very kind remarks, and also thank you to Kentucky American Water for sponsoring and for all those workers out there in the cold who are doing such a great job. Appreciate you reminding us about that. And to Bob, thanks to your team. Thanks for the invitation. All your members. Danny, thanks for your leadership as well. And we really appreciate the invitation to visit with you again. It's amazing. It's only been a year since I visited with you last November, and it's good to be back. I would remiss if I didn't at the outset mention the passing of Nelson Mandela, who we all mourn as a great leader. He fought for the dignity of every human being and the idea that every human being deserves an opportunity to live in freedom and to pursue his or her dreams and achieve their potential. It's been almost a full year since I was sworn in as your new congressman, And for the first 6 months, I often wondered, wow, how in the world did I get here? And then the last 6 months, I looked around and I said, how in the world did all these other people get here? But in all seriousness, a year ago, the people of Central and Eastern Kentucky gave me an important honor and a tremendous responsibility, when you really reflect on it, to represent them in the U.S. House of Representatives. In my election night speech last year, I spoke about looking forward. I said that the path won't be straight, nor will the journey always be smooth, but with your help, we will reach our destination. A place where the government of the people and by the people trusts the people. A place where a young person who gets a good education at UK or at Transylvania or at Midway College, I saw Dr. Marsden here, or KCTCS, where a young person who gets a good education, once they get out of school, they can get a good job. And a place of confidence and optimism where Americans once again believe that they will pass on a better country onto their children and their grandchildren. And Cheryl touched on this a moment. It's certainly not just me. I have 2 daughters. That animates my desire to try to make a difference. But every one of you who have kids or grandkids, that's what's on your minds. That's not a partisan issue. That's not a Republican-Democrat issue. That's what we all want. That's what unites us. That's what unites us as Americans. That's what makes us unique as a country, is that we have this American dream, the idea that we have an obligation to leave a better future for future generations. So since last year, I've worked hard to earn the confidence of the people of the 6th District by keeping my word. I promised to hold government accountable, to address our nation's crippling and growing debt, and most importantly, to get the American people back to work so that we can restore that American dream. And your input is critical to these efforts. It's why my staff and I have traveled throughout the 6th District over the last year, listening to your concerns and asking for your opinions on the issues before Congress and those facing you at home. Meet your congressman town hall meetings. We've done that in almost every county. Teletown hall meetings, you may have gotten a voicemail on your phone. We want to get your feedback during those telephone town halls. Mobile office visits once a month to each of the counties of the 19-county congressional district. We call this our accessibility initiative because I can only be as good of a representative as I get a chance to hear from you and listen to you. Staying in touch with my constituents isn't just about good politics, it's about good policy. It's what will produce the right policies. And regularly listening to the people of the 6th District has only reaffirmed that these fundamental interests, a federal government that is more accountable, policies that promote fiscal responsibility and force the government to live within its means, and an economy that produces jobs and prosperity and growth, have a real impact on real people and real families living in our communities on a daily basis. And that's why I've asked President Obama to come to Kentucky so he can see the impact of these policies on the 6,200 coal miners who have lost their jobs in the last few years because of the EPA's war on coal, on small community banks and job creators who are suffocating under an avalanche of red tape and compliance costs imposed by the Dodd-Frank law, on the single working mom whose hours at work have been scaled back because of Obamacare, and yes, on the nearly 300,000 Kentuckians who like their health insurance plans but were not allowed to keep them. This is all about people that I've met out there representing this district. It's about Angie, the young Air National Guardswoman from Madison County who I met in the airport in Charlotte, who wanted to pray for me and pray for our country because she was concerned about the growing national debt and how government was growing and hurting the American dream. It's about Sally, the young woman who came up to me with tears in her eyes at the end of a town hall meeting I conducted in Wolfe County on the far eastern edge of our district. And she talked about how her husband was a coal miner who had lost his job because of overregulation, and that it was time to go back to school, but because they had lost their paycheck, their monthly paycheck, she couldn't afford shoes for her kids. And so she had to buy them flip-flops so that her children wouldn't be embarrassed when they went back to school. It's about Thomas, who testified in front of our committee, the Financial Services Committee, earlier this week. Thomas is a fifth-generation banker from Bath County, Kentucky, Owensville, in the eastern part of our district. And his testimony was that his small community bank in Bath County had survived 140 years of being in business, survived the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 1970s and 80s. And he said that he was worried that his bank wouldn't survive another decade. He said the greatest risk over all those 140 years of being in business in Bath County, Kentucky, was not market risk, but was regulatory risk. It was man-made risk. It was Dodd-Frank. It's about Joe Bologna's, who testified in front of our field hearing about Obamacare. Joe Bologna is, of course, the great pizza entrepreneur, second-generation American who has got that popular joint down there on campus that has the best breadsticks, garlic breadsticks in all of Lexington, probably all of Kentucky. And he had to scale back his workforce. He had to close down Joe Bologna's restaurant on Mondays just to come in compliance with the requirements under Obamacare. And finally, it's about Tony. Tony is a truck driver who stood up in my town hall meeting in Winchester. He said he's a member of the Teamsters Union, but he was losing his health insurance. And so he did what he thought was going to work for him, and he went to the Connect Exchange, the Kentucky exchange that's supposed to be working, and the website is working better in Kentucky, so he was very hopeful that he could find replacement coverage. The only problem for Tony is that as he said, he had stage 4 lymphoma. And when he looked to get replacement coverage, the cheapest policy he could find on the exchange was $1,800 more a month. These are real people facing real challenges where the government is not helping them. The government is hurting these families in Kentucky. And I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. I don't even know if Sally or Thomas or Tony or any of these people are Republicans or Democrats. It really doesn't matter. What matters is it's not right for the government to put working American families into economic distress. And there's one theme that runs through all these stories. The point that all of these people were making to me was this: the American people should have the right and the freedom to control their own lives and make decisions for themselves and their families, rather than have Washington politicians and bureaucrats take control and make decisions for them. It's about holding Washington accountable. And in Obamacare, unfortunately, we see a lack of accountability when a government gets too big and tries to do too much. We see incompetence, we see broken promises, we see arrogance, we see massive cost, we see failure. And it's not because we want it to fail. We want it to work, but it's not. And it's disappointing because health care does need fixing. It does need fixing. But this is not working. By growing government in Washington and by putting government in charge of health care, we haven't fixed it. We've made it worse. And we've deprived the American people of the ability to control their own health care. Obamacare's problems are much bigger than a billion-dollar website that doesn't work. The problems are coming at the American people in waves. The website's just the first wave. Last Sunday's report that the administration had made some 400 software fixes doesn't mean that the federal website is working. The back-end website is still unfinished, and insurers are unable to obtain the accurate information about the people who have enrolled. There's also the real problem of the security of the website. McAfee says the site is a hacker's dream. Personal, sensitive healthcare and financial information at risk. No wonder, according to a recent Pew survey, only 19% of Americans trust the government to do what is right always or most of the time. Then there's the broken promises. If you like your doctor, you will be able to keep your doctor, period. If you like your health plan, you'll be able to keep your health plan, period. No one will take it away no matter what. Well, tell that to the 16 million Americans who are losing their current health insurance and slowly discovering that their doctor, with whom they may have had a relationship for years, or who may be treating them for a chronic disease, is no longer in their network. Obamacare was supposed to decrease the number of the uninsured, but at least at the outset, far more Americans have lost their health insurance rather than gained it. You may like the policy. You may like Obamacare. You may not like Obamacare, but at least one thing is certain, and that's that the American people were not told the truth about whether or not you can keep your health insurance. And think about the arrogance of government officials who dismiss these concerns by outlawing insurance policies freely chosen and voluntarily purchased by consumers and freely offered and affordably priced by insurers. Some say these policies are substandard. These insurance products may not meet the one-size-fits-all criteria of a government bureaucrat. But why should the government decide that? Why not let individuals and families decide what products they want, what health care they can afford, instead of having Washington dictate those choices for them? And finally, the cost. Premiums are skyrocketing. When people are able to sign up on the exchanges, or as they're getting their premium like Tony, they're discovering insurance is no longer affordable. And it's not affordable for the taxpayers either. The President said in the weeks before and during the shutdown that Obamacare shouldn't be part of the discussion about funding the government or raising the debt limit. But Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is fundamentally connected to spending and debt. It was passed, after all, through the budget reconciliation process, which is a budget-related law. And so if we are just to now totally disregard a $2 trillion spending bill in the context of how are we going to manage our finances in the next decade, in the next 2 decades, the next 3 decades, that's inconsistent with Congress's ongoing responsibility to constantly scrutinize federal spending. And all of this is so unfortunate because we have offered and we will continue to offer real reforms. We know that Obamacare doesn't work, but we haven't tried simple patient-centered reforms that would lower the cost without growing government. House Republicans have offered nearly 200 bills during the current Congress that would replace Obamacare's top-down, factory-like, one-size-fits-all system in which decisions are centralized in the hands of bureaucrats, with quality patient-centered principles that use competition and innovation to drive down costs, to crack down on frivolous lawsuits, reduce waste, fraud, and abuse, and to increase quality. We think that doctors, patients, and families should be in charge of health care instead of Washington bureaucrats. We want to increase access to affordable health care choices for all Americans. So what are these proposals? Make insurance compete nationwide across state lines. Make hospital and doctor bills more transparent so consumers know what they're paying for. Allow small businesses to pool together in association health plans so that they can pool together and achieve the same purchasing power as large corporations. Provide a universal tax deduction or credit for buying health insurance and allow families and individuals to deduct health care costs from their income taxes. Changing the tax code to end the preference for employer-based health insurance and making insurance policies portable. The tax code should treat everybody fairly, whether you get your insurance on your own, if you're self-employed, or you get it through your job. High deductible health savings plans, health savings accounts allow people to save on a tax-free basis for health care expenses. Cracking down on junk lawsuits. A Democrat colleague of mine, Dr. Andy Barr from California, he's a fellow freshman. He reached out to me, I reached out to him. He's a Democrat, I'm a Republican. But what we said was we can do health care reform better by creating an alternative to our legal system right now to crack down on frivolous lawsuits. And this is a bill we're going to be introducing in the next few weeks that takes advantage of physician practice guidelines to provide safe harbors for doctors who are doing it the right way, but also allowing plaintiffs who truly have claims to continue to pursue them. And we can guarantee that people with pre-existing conditions can get affordable coverage through state-run high-risk pools. Obamacare underfunded the high-risk pool, and there's 40,000 Americans who, under Obamacare, have been denied coverage for their pre-existing conditions. So all this brings us to also the national debt, right? Because former Senator Phil Gramm once said that balancing the budget is like going to heaven. Everybody wants to do it, but nobody wants to make the trip. And it is hard. You know, people have different opinions, and October was miserable. It was bad for the American people. The government shutdown was a terrible thing for this country. It was not good to have these kind of partisan games in Washington, the brinkmanship. I certainly didn't like it. I didn't support it. I voted 26 times to prevent the shutdown, to fund the government. And I also voted twice for the Full Faith and Credit Act, which would prevent default. And last February, I voted to raise the debt limit in the context of other reforms that will actually change the way Washington does business. But as important as bipartisanship is, as important as avoiding a government shutdown is, as important it is to avoid default, and those are all very important, it is equally important that Congress begin to address our growing $17 trillion national debt and start making the tough decisions to put our country on a path towards a balanced budget. Quite simply, it is unfair. It is unfair to our children, to future generations of Americans, to continue to spend money we don't have and raise the debt ceiling without getting government spending under control. Our nation's exploding debt is the single greatest threat to our prosperity, our national security, and our general welfare. We are adding between $12 billion and $20 billion to the national debt every single week. The national debt now exceeds the size of the entire U.S. economy. Interest on our national debt, with interest rates historically low, are more than double what we spend on our veterans. And by 2026, if we make no reforms, 100% of all federal revenue will be consumed by 4 items in the federal budget: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the national debt. This is crowding out our ability to fund vital infrastructure and transportation. It's crowding out our ability to fund Pell Grants. It's crowding out our ability to help support the National Cancer Institute designation at the University of Kentucky and all of the other important research that goes on in our public universities. We have to deal with this. And so when Paul Ryan, who Gatewood Arnold is in the audience, Gatewood Arnold went to Miami University with Paul Ryan. They're good college friends. When Paul Ryan, the Budget Committee chairman, told me that the debt ceiling vote that ended the shutdown in October would add nearly $750 billion to the national debt with no reforms, I said that that's not what the people elected me to do. They elected me to stop business as usual in Washington, to make the reforms necessary to start putting the country on a path towards a balanced budget. And so we've been doing that. We supported a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. We supported and I co-sponsored the No Budget, No Pay Act, common sense legislation mandating that if Congress doesn't pass a budget, if it doesn't do its most basic responsibility under the Constitution, then members of Congress shouldn't get paid. I voted for a budget that cut spending by over $4.5 trillion and balances within 10 years. And to eliminate the seemingly constant threat of ruinous default, I co-sponsored legislation guaranteeing that America's debts would be paid on time. These are real solutions and real reforms, and they stand in stark contrast to the budget tricks, the accounting gimmicks, and the empty promises we have seen so often coming out of Washington. I predict there will not be another government shutdown. But I also unfortunately predict that there will not be the grand bargain that we need to really, truly solve this problem in the next few months. So we'll be working on doing the best we can to avert default, to avoid a shutdown, but also make some reforms in a bipartisan way to start putting the country on a path towards a balanced budget. I want to conclude by talking about the final solution to these issues. And that is that we can deal with these problems in part by growing our economy, by putting the country back on a path towards prosperity. Part of the solution is a healthy economy, so let me address some of the steps we've taken to specifically benefit the economy of our region and support Kentucky families. We've got these great signature industries: the horse industry, the bourbon distilling industry, manufacturing, auto manufacturing with Toyota and Lexmark, agriculture and finance. So one of the things we've got to do is make sure our tax policies help promote these job-creating engines in our backyard. So in the horse industry, we've got a bill called the Equine Tax Parity, which would reduce the capital gains holding period for horses from 24 to 12 months, eliminating an antiquated tax shelter that discourages investment in the equine industry. The Racehorse Cost Recovery Act is my bill that I've introduced as the chairman of the Congressional Horse Caucus. This is a priority for the horse industry that would make permanent the 3-year depreciation for horses, for thoroughbreds, and for racehorses. And as a member of the Congressional Bourbon Caucus, I've introduced a similar measure for our spirit, the Aged Distilled Spirits Competitiveness Act, to correct provisions in the tax code that disadvantage our bourbon distillers compared to other spirit producers and foreign competitors. If passed, this will no longer produce a discriminatory treatment of bourbon just because bourbon has to go into those famous white charred barrels, charred oak barrels. And I think, as we all agree, that's what makes the difference. Just a few weeks ago, this organization, Commerce Lexington, helped host the Lithuanian ambassador, Pavlionis, the Lithuanian ambassador to the United States. I met the ambassador in Washington, and we started talking about Lithuania and Kentucky. And Lithuania is a progressive country. They want to engage in more aggressive trade. Already 130 American companies have a presence in Lithuania. It's home to one of the most highly educated workforces in all of Europe. And so we invited him to come to Kentucky to tour our bourbon distilleries. And he came, and Dr. Lyons hosted us at Alltech, and Commerce Lexington did a great job hosting him. We partnered with the Kentucky Distillers Association. He visited Wild Turkey and Woodford Reserve and Buffalo Trace. And then, because Lithuanians love basketball, we took him to Rupp Arena that night, and we had a great time. But it was not long after he was in the Bluegrass that the ambassador started talking about our bourbon. And he said, you know what? Vodka is the occupier's drink. Bourbon is the drink of freedom. So we'll continue to do these kinds of things. Obviously, you know about our advocacy to fight for our coal industry, to rein in burdensome regulations there. Lexmark was in the U.S. Supreme Court earlier this week. I had a chance to support Lexmark in its landmark litigation that reached all the way to the highest court in the land, and we're going to be visiting with them later today. As a member of the Auto Manufacturing Caucus in Congress, we're fighting for Toyota and all the exciting things that are happening there, including the new Lexus line that's going in. We're supporting the bid to bring the World Equestrian Games back to Kentucky, and I'm excited to have supported that effort, and will continue to do so. So we'll continue to take these steps, because if we get the people of Kentucky back to work, if we get the people of this country back to work, that's going to rise all boats. And these are controversial times. You may not agree with everything that I said here today about specific policies, Obamacare, the debt, or whatever. But one thing that we're going to continue to strive to do is listen to you, listen to your concerns, your interests, the signature industries of our Commonwealth, and be an advocate for you, an ambassador for you in Washington, D.C. And I thank you all for hosting me here today. I'd be happy to take any questions, and we're always, always open for your feedback. Thank you, and God bless. And Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. Shirley, we've got some questions out there. I'd be happy to take any. Yes, sir.
How about all these giveaways?
Giveaways in terms of spending, or? Well, one thing we're trying to do, of course, is what we want to do is we want to have a compassionate safety net. Unfortunately, because the economy has suffered, because the economy, frankly, has suffered in our state and has not fully recovered, we do have a lot of people who are in situations of dislocation. Sally, the young lady in Wolfe County, is a perfect example. I think the fact that so many people have become dependent on food stamps is more not an indictment of them. It's an indictment of the policies in Washington that haven't gotten them back to work. It's an indictment of the policies that are putting people out of work, especially in our coal fields. And so the real answer is empowering people and families to get back to work. So, number one, we've got to promote pro-growth policies. We're also, though, trying to reform the way our important safety net programs operate, because what we want is a pathway back into the workforce. And so, for example, in the Farm Bill, I voted for reforms to the to the food stamps program as part of the Farm Bill. Not because we want to cut food stamps. In fact, it's actually slowing the growth of the food stamps program. We're under the reform bill that we passed, we're going to be spending over $700 billion in food stamps over the next 10 years if those reforms were to go into effect. But what we want to do is we want to have that for folks who don't have dependents, for folks who are of working age population or working age. We want a work requirement. We want a requirement that they seek job training. We want a requirement that they be looking actively for work, because we want to remove the impediments that are placed in their way when we want to encourage them to get back to a position of self-sufficiency and self-esteem. Thank you.
Congressman, thank you for coming. You mentioned the debt several times, and I think you really have a handle on it. You understand it. Last year it was $360 billion in interest of what we were spending. In 3 years, it's going to be $720 billion if we don't have any uptick in interest rates. If the uptick happens, which it could, we're talking maybe $1 trillion in interest on the debt, which would be 1/3 of today's current spending. You seem to understand it, but it's not part of our national dialogue, and 80% of the population probably doesn't have a clue what's coming at them as a huge train wreck. Are we going to make this a national discussion? How are we going to stop this?
Well, here's what I would say. I don't think this really is an ideological partisan issue. We're all in this together, and if you're a liberal and you want a robust safety net in this country, if you're a conservative or a Tea Partier or whatever you might be and you want fiscal responsibility and a small government, put that aside for a minute. It's a math problem. It doesn't add up anymore. And so if we want a safety net that is going to work, if we want a government that's going to be able to keep its promises to people when they retire, we have to reform these programs so that the government doesn't start breaking its promises. That's what this is all about. So you're right. It's crowding out all of our domestic discretionary spending. The sequester is a bad policy from the standpoint that it doesn't set priorities. But we're only going to be able to reverse the sequester and make the additional investments that we need at the University of Kentucky, in the National Institutes of Health, in crumbling roads, bridges, and infrastructure, in science and technology, and national security and homeland security. We're only going to be able to do that is if we reform our mandatory spending programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which are growing as a share of the national budget. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to cut benefits for seniors. That's not what it means. What it means is that for younger people, people my age, 40 years old and younger, Medicare is going to look a little different. We're living longer. The programs need to change and evolve and modernize so that the government will be able to keep the commitment to young people when they retire.
Congressman Barr, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. I see you so many times. You're truly a representative of this district. And I know I heard a lot of times last year some folks were talking about like coal is not an issue for the 6th district. But I believe that a representative, any Kentucky representative, represents the state, above the district itself as well. And, this war on coal business, it's not just about the miners losing jobs and stuff. It's about setting a bar so high that the cost is too high to burn it, and we lose one of our major competitive edges, and that's cheaper electricity, which is attractive to business to come here to Kentucky to create jobs in that regard as well. And, I appreciate you standing up. Even though there's no coal mines in the 6th district, I think it's still a very much a Kentucky issue and affects every one of us.
Well, thanks for your comments, and I agree with you. Cheap electricity is the ace in the hole, is our ace in the hole. We have some of the lowest industrial utility costs in America, and I can tell you, if you talk to the manufacturers, certainly Toyota and others, having cheap, affordable, reliable power is pretty important in terms of job creation. It's pretty important in terms of our economic competitiveness. And when the coal industry suffers, it's not just those 6,200 families that lose a paycheck. It's also the people in Millersburg in Bourbon County and in Nicholas County. The Joy Mining Manufacturing Facility out of business over there. That's 100 jobs gone from Bourbon County, and they have no coal mines in Bourbon County. So it's cheap electricity. It's all the ancillary businesses that are suffering because of bad policies coming out of Washington. Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you for your question. You know, I don't know about aggressive. Here's the it needs to be gradual. You don't want to pull the rug out of under people and change the expectations of people. You don't, not in the middle of the game. But I will say this, again, speaking to you know, the chairman of the Budget Committee, and how this is, again, not a partisan issue. It's the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan agency that says that if we don't start making the changes now, then it's going to get harder and harder to have a gradual approach to the reforms. So time is of the essence. The sooner we make some reforms for younger people, the better, because if we wait, if we keep kicking the can down the road, our ability to make that transition a more gradual transition becomes much more difficult.
Else I got another. I got one more.
Okay, yes, sir.
The Democrats and Republicans, they always seem to squabble. What is your stance on doing away with the Republican Party and the Democrat Party? And anybody in this room, when you run for office, you run as a United States American citizen, not as a Democrat, not as a Republican. You run for everybody, not just one party. What is your stance on that?
Well, that's really how I ran, because when I ran, guess what? This district, listen, the American people are tired of the partisanship for sure. They want solutions, real results. And like I said, it doesn't matter for these families whether they're Republican or Democrat. It's whether or not the policies in Washington are working for them. And so what I would say is this: I've tried very earnestly to work in a bipartisan way, joining the Bipartisan United Solutions Caucus in Washington for the freshman class, working with Dr. Andy Barr on this medical malpractice bipartisan bill, working with Congressman John Delaney, Democrat from Maryland, on the Partnership to Build America Act, an innovative bipartisan infrastructure financing bill that doesn't add to the debt and doesn't raise taxes. We've got to do that. We have to be proactive about reaching across the aisle. And I am optimistic that we're not going to have a repeat of what we saw in October. I'm getting good reports from the work that's being done from Patty Murray and Paul Ryan on trying to do something to partially reverse the sequester and start doing the small, achievable things to put the country on the path towards a balanced budget. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.